Hello and welcome to episode 49 of Cybeats Powerhouse Perspective. My name is Chris Blask. I'm the Vice President of Strategy with Cybeats. And with me today is a good friend, Andre Ristaino, who's been with ISA for many years, but has a fascinating background for our purposes as well. So, hey, Andre, how are you?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here. It's a beautiful Friday afternoon. My last call, and this is a fun one.
Right? And where in the world are you?
I'm in Chapel Hill. I live in a house about 5 miles outside of the city of Chapel Hill. We're on 10 acres out here.
And your wife does diving down in the Keys as well, as we were talking about in the green room before this. And I was just in Raleigh for an OWASP thing a month or so ago. I should have reached out. But so as we're discussing, on this show, we sort of talk to folks like you. Like with 49 now, we've had a sort of amazing array of folks. A lot of them, you are our friends, and everybody's got a fascinating path through all this, right? And while this is sponsored by Cybeats and we're an SBOM management company, we love to talk about software, bill of materials, and everything else. The reason all of that really interests me is the same reason that ISA interests me, right? That in the operational technology world, right, we've been doing a lot of things for decades, in some cases centuries. But in the cyber world, in the IT world, we're like, hey, this is brand new, right? And supply chain is just such a cartoon example of that. And your background in that is literally, you live the example, right?
Yep, we had there. I belong to APICS, American Production and Inventory Control Society. They had a certification, CPIM, certified in production and inventory management. Then they had a derivative of that, certified in supply chain management. And so I didn't get the second one, but that's what we did. The whole idea was, all this just-in-time inventory management, so you don't have piles of inventory sitting around. That's dead money. It's a big investment, and it gets obsolete. There's a whole lot of things that's wrong with having too much inventory around.
Well, I always think about the UPC codes, right? Because that was something, I'm old enough to have seen that, right? As a kid, you go, to the store with your mom, your parents, and close for inventory, right? Which means that in every retail location in the world, had to actually stop being a business for a while, constantly, and physically count everything, right? And then we go through the whole just in time, and it's like actually we have exactly the right amount of stuff, and it would crash the global economy and go back to the old ways. There's more lost in managing all that extra inventory than there is in profits and margins these days.
Well, we saw what it looked like when we had the pandemic, because supply chains were disrupted, and we used to make fun of the old days, where there were I was doing this in the 80s and 90s, and there were still some old school managers that never wanted to run out of stuff, so they had what we call just in case inventory. So they always overbought, so their production lines would never slow down or shut down, and so they ended up over investing in on hand inventory. And so just in case inventory instead of just in time. And then when the pandemic hit and the trucking and trains were moving slower, and there's disruptions, everybody went back to just in case inventory again. Because they never knew when they were going to get it. It's like hoarding food when you don't know where your next meal's coming from.
Well, which Anthony, if you put that first question up there, we're sort of gets to that to this first topic, looking back, right? And it's far enough. And it's 4 years now since the DBOM, the digital bill of materials, thing sort of started. And Median Cesare and I, published a Unisys blog on topic right before the pandemic hit. And I remember thinking about it, there was two arguments to make. One is what we're talking about now is like the global supply chain is so high value that it has to, we have to evolve it, right? And forces are driving us down the path that'll mean we have to do things like we're doing now in software supply chain And but of course, then the pandemic happened, and what we talked about in the article happened. The cost was so massive globally that I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah, just in case inventory globally, it must have been hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods piling up in
Yeah,
a
trillions.
you know,
I'm sure trillions. Yeah.
trillions, right? So it's so not to answer my own question, but so I think kind of the answer to this first one was it was simpler in the old days. It was also more expensive.
Yep. It was definitely more expensive. That was the reason, for investment in, ability to identify material and have visibility into where it is in the its journey from the manufacturer to you when you're using whatever the components are. How long does that take? Is it on the truck? Is it at the back door of the facility on its way here? Today you order something off Amazon and you can go on and look at your order and you can see that it's been picked, then it's on the truck, then it's at, maybe UPS drops it at the US Postal Service. They're all connecting with each other now, and you have 100% visibility all the way through. Very sophisticated. And in fact, once it's on, when I see these things on the truck out for delivery, I'm like, well, I know where this guy goes. It should be here by 3, even though they promised 10 o'clock. I always get it at 3. So, but yeah, it really helped out, in the, I installed enterprise resource planning systems, and, you had all this tracking and automated generation of purchase orders to do resupplies when you get below a certain point, and then electronic data interchange, they call it. In those days, you get a purchase order receipt that says they acknowledge you got it, and then so yeah, now it's the visibility is amazing. We didn't have it in the old days.
Right. And Anthony, so the second question, right? So I dropped out of high school in Toronto and got a job working in a printing plant, made all the Sears catalogs in Canada, and so bills of material, an actual bill of material. My earliest working experience, is seeing these pieces of paper that come in with train cars full of big, huge rolls of paper, and various other products and so forth. So 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, anyways, when I first started obsessing with the supply chain thing, it again felt to me a lot like OT. Right. This is one of these things that in the OT world we've been doing forever. Right. Actually, tracking bills of material is something that you can't, and when I got into the printing industry, it was sort of the end of that era. The photo engraving and Electrotypers Limited was the company I worked for, and still had the 3-story presses that were the height of, technology, in the early 1900s.
Right.
And, but those companies couldn't exist back in the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution. A lot of that was about paperwork. Right. And I like talking in these conversations, let's talk about Hammurabi, and let's talk about the millions of clay tablets, all over Mesopotamia. We've been doing this for thousands of years.
Yep.
And that, but your example with Amazon is exactly right. So I think the answer to this one is kind of look at your damn phone, right? We're so used to that sort of transparency because, sorry to finish my, long analogy, but the effort of taking a software bill or a bill of material, this paper bill of material from the printing plant, in the 80s, and making that transparent to anyone was ridiculous. What am I supposed to do? Walk down? I'm going to, write it down, go up to the office, tell somebody else to tell our customers that the shipment arrived. It was, whereas now it's got to the point where we've automated it to literally UPS and Amazon and the Postal Service, get hundreds of millions of Americans the information immediately to our phones.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, when you look at your software bills of material or H-bombs or D-bombs, whatever, incarnation you have, there's there's value in the information. A long time ago, when you would purchase something, let's say you're purchasing a raw material input, You know, you want to know, let's say it's hexane or something in the process industry. It might be one element, but you also want to know the quality information for it, right? You know, how pure it is, etc. And that'll tell you how you're going to use it in the next step. So that was important to have that transparency about, you know, the characteristics of the input. Interestingly, you bring up printing presses. We did a project for Bowater Pulp and Paper, and they're based in South Carolina. And they provided the newsprint for the Washington Post and a couple other newspapers. And this was in the late 80s, was it late 80s, early 90s? But I think it was Foxborough had these sensors that would go across the newsprint. The newsprint came off a 26-foot wide roll, and then they'd go through slitters and make it into the newsprint size. Well, they would capture the moisture and you know how thick it is and how clean the paper was, etc. And so they knew, you know, how runnable it was, and they, as a value add, they started giving that information to the Washington Post and the other guys. Well, then it turns out that they were asking for only the rolls of paper that came from the right-hand side of the roll, because they figured out that the ones on the left with these certain characteristics wouldn't run on their newsprint very well, or not as well, and they would have paper breaks and have to reset the machine, and you know, to do it, and it would disrupt their newsprint production. And so after a while, all their customers got savvy, and nobody wanted the left-hand side. Everyone wanted to right. And so they had to stop giving them that information because they wouldn't be able to sell any left-hand side paper. You know, it's just one of those things. But so that was one of those areas where the transparency about where it actually came from, what part of the roll it came off of, you know, was an indicator of you know, a product quality thing. But it was a two-edged sword. They thought that the customer would be happy with the added information, and they were, but it created another business headache for them.
Well, the optimist in me hopes that there was a second part of that story. They must have gone back and fixed the process, right? You know, so something about that process is making different quality between two sides of the roll. You know, you know, it had me thinking. You know, I loved my view into that sort of last era of the 1900s industrial revolution, because the physical characteristics, these engineers who've been running by this point these presses for decades, and the bindery and so forth, had, you know, mechanical ways, you know, air hoses, copper pipes, and directing exactly how the tip, so that as the paper hits a certain point, right? It was just fascinating, right? And it's, you know, it kind of comes to our point here, right? Because as that whole mechanical industrial revolution progressed, it became, at the beginning, you know, you do this by hand, right? And the example you gave, you know, was a point along that path, where they automated it, and, you know, found value in that, and problems, you know, that probably caused, process improvements, or at least process study afterwards. And it's kind of similar with where we are right now, right? You know, in the SBOM world, right? This you know, the last couple of years has been all the conversation. And can you generate? Do you have an SBOM? And, you know, we do this management part. So we've been working with folks, and, you know, Schneider Electric, you know, is one of our OT customers we can talk about. And so folks, you know, right, you know, who are at this point with these sort of organizations where, okay, they're producing lots and lots, and they're figuring out and managing them. However, right, you know, the scale, right, we still get to this automation level, you know, where we're kind of at right now in the software supply chain world, where you can't do it by hand anymore. And your printing, your paper example, you know, at that point, you know, they couldn't measure that stuff by hand anymore economically. The data caused them some problems, but, you know, a decade later, they never could look back in that automation.
No, instrumenting the process provided visibility into it, and they identified where the problems were, and they could start improving their quality, et cetera. So that was a good thing. The temporary blip was a temporary blip, but this whole thing with the software bills and material, for some folks they think, oh, this is new, how do you do this? It's like, no, we've been doing bills and material since 1925, and then we've been doing lot tracking. When I was putting in the ERP systems for the pharmaceutical companies, we would do lot tracking of all the ingredients that went into product, and you could trace it all the way back to its original the chemical compounds out of a bucket, which in turn was lot tracked at that manufacturer. They knew where everyone was produced, when it was produced, and in the pharma business, they knew which machine, like you produce a bunch of tablets, which packaging line it went on. They have these slats for sliding the tablets down into blister packs. You knew who was signed in and on the production line that day, which serial numbered slat they were using, everything. And it had multiple benefits. One was for quality and quality improvement. And the other was in case there was a problem with their end product, and then they could go back and do the analysis and determine if it was a component or ingredient problem, or was it a process or component problem, or was it a person problem, right?
Right.
And so they could do the analysis. But more importantly, now that everything's lot tracked, once it hits the shelf at the grocery store, if there was a problem, like you remember that Tylenol poisoning thing, if anything gets tainted, they can start tracking. They can track the lots and identify which ones to pull. In the old days, if there was a recall, they would pull everything off the shelf. That was it. Take everything out of the supply chain from the production floor on out into the supply chain. Maybe some of them still do that now in the farmer because of liability. That's cheaper, but you don't have to do that anymore. You can do lots. You see it on the news now. If you have lot number XYZ on your aspirin bottle, throw it out.
So Anthony, put the last question up there because that's, I will give the inside joke to this one. The ISA 62443 set of standards are the way to do cybersecurity in OT, and it's all about zoning at the end of the day. Breaking things into logical chunks, which to the talk about lots is the same sort of thing, in its own way. And I look at all of this. Right. Everything you just said could be said about the software running the machine that's making those pharmaceuticals. I want to know where this lot on this day on this machine right there, what software is running on it, what software is inside that software. And to find that out, I just need to say software where you said everything else.
Right.
We already have the processes. We already basically do this. Everybody's used to it. It's just an additional step. Right.
Well, we used to also, provide the, I'd call it production management systems for computers. So when you look like waveform machines, those are the pinout machines where you're putting chips on a board. We'd have these commodity chips, and they came in these rolls. They look like rolls of tape, but they had chips on them. They were feeders, and they'd feed in. And each one of those rolls had its own lot ID and manufacturing date and where it came from and all that. And so every single board, you knew where all the chips came from. So you could trace it all back and what firmware was loaded onto it, et cetera. So, in this business, that's been done for, years. Panasonic, waveform machines. And then at the end, you put it on a rack and it squirts the software onto it, right? And
right.
So it's been done just as part of a production environment for years, so this is nothing new. So it's all doable, and the technology's there, and your company's doing the technology, and at some level. There's micro level looking at things, and then there's more macro level. But at any rate, so it's nothing new.
Well, that's why I like the zoning analogy, in this part of thinking it through, because what we've been doing is in these industrial processes basically kind of zoning, right? I'm the chip manufacturer in this example, and you are downstream from me. I know that there's a zone between the two of us. We're going to transfer information in that space, right? And downstream of me, I'll handle that information appropriately as agreed with my upstream partner, right? And again, these are very well-worn paths to create these spaces, and this again, the DBOM thing is DBOM.io. DBOM is an Alliance Foundation project. It's not about bills of material. It's sort of unfortunately named. I apologize for that, but the idea is you create zones, you create channels, between nodes, and this is I see it as an industrial process. If I'm a chip manufacturer and I'm providing those rolls of chips, or I'm putting them on the boards. There is this zone between us. There's this channel between us with policies on it where all this information is already being exchanged. And all we're talking about is saying, hey, I want this information too, right? One of the examples I like using is, and depending on your criticality, again, all these existing systems will support it. I could, for example, say, I want to know what keyboard was attached to what computer when your fab designer clicked save on the fab that was used to make those chips or whatever. Right. And that could just be tagged on to all these existing processes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's part of the product information, what production equipment was used on it. So the 62443 standards, they were the 4-1 standard says you have to keep an inventory that, to be compliant, you have to have an inventory of what went into a product. So that's hardware and software, but it also asks for the tools used. So you need to know what the compiler was if you're doing compiling, and some other tools or test tools, and test tool version. So that's a pretty big ask, and it's pretty comprehensive, I should say. So when people ask me about this 4-1 compliant with SBOMs, I'm like, yeah, SBOMs is part of it. There's more to it than just SBOMs, and so it requires it.
Right, it ends up being the reasonable and prudent sort of thing. I like 4.1. I like NERC 13 as well, right? It's because at this point it's kind of hard to say specifically, and maybe we shouldn't, but if you can. It was 1983. Could you get an SBOM? No. But it's 2023. You can.
Yeah.
If you don't, you're not really diligent, and you shouldn't be compliant with anything.
Yeah. So, but yeah, the SBOMs are the standards tell what you need to do. They're saying we need an inventory of the software and hardware. SBOMs is for doing that, for the software portion of it. So that's a good thing. When I was doing, the consulting for the pharma companies, they had batch records. So every batch of product that went through, they had to have records and sign-offs at every single step, and they do a quality review and make sure that was signed off, and in-process testing, which you do in software. But it was done on paper, and they had huge banker boxes. So, when a batch went through, you might have 40 of these things, and it's all signed off, and the FDA would come in and audit it. And so that was one approach. And I was doing this work at the time when electronic document management was just coming into the fray, like Documentum and another one. So you could have electronic batch records and electronic signatures. And FDA was saying, what's a legitimate way of doing electronic signatures? Both of them perfectly acceptable as a way to satisfy the keeping a record of how that batch was produced. So in the SBOM world, that would be a lot of banker boxes for products that have millions of lines of code.
Right, that are changing all the time, and every batch of code has different types of SBOMs attached to it, build, deployed, and so on and so forth. So,
but conceptually, the same idea, a way to keep a record of where it was created and what its history is and the updates and the whole thing. And so it's all electronic. And the concept of SBOMs for many companies was pretty easy because they were already doing it. There's no way that you can have these big process management software applications, like an Emerson Delta V or a Triconix, and millions of lines of code, and some of them are programmed in the UK, and then other parts are done in India, and then another part in Foxborough.
Thousands of open source libraries.
Yeah. And so at some point, they got to bring all this stuff together and do a big build. So if you don't have sophisticated development software that has the inventory of all these parts and how they go together and what sequence, you wouldn't be able to manage this code. You couldn't possibly produce the code. So the SBOM is just that
enunciating.
It's a necessary capability to have to even do the job.
Well, so, I know we've gone really long. It's always hard to because there's so many things to talk about. But again, it's just we couldn't have done these things 10 years ago, but we have the information now, and sort of everything you're saying, we hear this, and out in the world a lot now. It's like it's just a diligence question. Can you produce an SBOM? No, seriously, like you really don't. You have all that. You should have all that information. How are you managing all this code if you can't say out loud to us what's in it?
So the last question, you were asking about zoning. Is the future fully zoned? The answer is no. When I look at, just in these production facilities, the network architectures are all flattening out. You look at time sensitive networking, TSN. I don't 100% understand it, but that's basically just a bus and everything goes across it. So there is no, and you look at wireless, there's no such thing as a zone in wireless. You can't put a boundary on except for how long a signal will transmit, right? So in a wireless environment, you have one zone.
Well, there's cryptographic zoning. This is a topic for a whole other conversation, right? But I still, maybe I'm just getting old, but I love that logical structure, right? And I think it kind of falls out that way, though. We're certainly not air gapping things anymore, but logically, anyways, I think we covered a lot of ground. Andre, I want to thank you for everything, sharing information with all the rest of us, everything you've done for the industry for all the years, and for being a great friend. Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you down there in Florida the next time I'm down there. And it's a good way to end a Friday afternoon.
Good. Glad to help. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll see you next time on this channel.